right, welcome back to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, John Davidson, political editor at the Federalist, and I'm joined today by Josh Jones. He's a senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, working on immigration, and he's also a former Department of Justice prosecutor for 18 years with the Department of Justice, working on organized crime. Now working on security issues and writing for Texas Public Policy Foundation, where I should say, full disclosure, I'm also a senior fellow working on immigration issues. So there's a lot to talk about. Josh, welcome to the program and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's talk about, you wrote a paper recently for the Texas Public Policy Foundation on the role of Mexican drug cartels and transnational gangs, essentially Central American gangs that control territory in Central America and have a presence in the United States. And I want to talk about that paper because I think it's very relevant to what we're seeing right now with the border crisis and the surge in illegal immigration. But first, I want to just talk about like the news that's happening over the past week, last week, and even earlier today. Because there's so much happening so quickly at the border. And I just saw a headline saying that President Biden has appointed Vice President Kamala Harris to oversee they don't say border crisis, but the challenge at the border, which seems like a strange choice to make. You would think that the thing to do would be to actually appoint the heads of nominate someone to lead Customs and Border Protection, nominate someone to lead USCIS, nominate someone to lead the Border Patrol. The Biden administration hasn't done any of that. So there's no one formally confirmed to head these federal agencies that are charged with managing border security, with dealing with illegal immigration. What is your reaction to this announcement today that the vice president is going to be heading up the border response for the administration?
Yeah, well, it seems like she's going to be stepping on Secretary Mayorkas a little bit because he is Senate confirmed, and this should be his, he's DHS secretary. This should be his thing to handle, and he has been trying to handle it. He most recently on Sunday on the news shows telling the world that the border is closed, which runs contrary to recent news that only 15% of migrant adult families are being turned away at the border. So I think the Biden administration is realizing that they have a real messaging problem, and I think that's probably the reason that they're bringing in Kamala Harris, the vice president, to handle it.
I mean, they don't just have a messaging problem either. They have a real problem at the border, but they don't want to acknowledge that, right? So, Mayorkas going on the shows to say there is no crisis and the border's closed, essentially saying don't believe your lying eyes, because the very next day, the Democratic congressman from Texas released these photos of the migrant facilities that are housing these unaccompanied minors that are way over capacity, people sleeping on the floor, temporary tent-like facilities, very similar to what we saw during the Trump administration in 2019, and very similar to what we saw during the Obama administration in 2014, when we had the surge of unaccompanied minors coming across the border. So what do you make of the insistence, the continuing insistence of the administration that this isn't a crisis when the truth is getting out there? They've tried a media blackout. They've tried to bar Border Patrol liaison officers and CBP press people from answering any questions, even from local reporters down in South Texas, referring all the questions to Washington, denying all requests for ride-alongs, denying all requests for access to these facilities. And yet the truth is getting out there. And now even corporate media outlets are covering this critically at the Washington Post, at CNN, and elsewhere. How long can the administration keep saying, don't believe your lying eyes, there's no crisis at the border, when we're on pace now for 17,000 unaccompanied minors for the month of March?
Yeah, the numbers are staggering. I think in February, the total number of encounters at the border was over 100,000, which is an incredible number. I guess they can keep saying it as long as they want to, but the reality is that everyone can see, and as you said, it's not just Fox News, it's CNN and MSNBC that are now covering it and now calling it what it is, which is a crisis. And it's a humanitarian crisis.
Let's talk about the numbers for a little bit, because we have something like 550 on average minors coming into federal custody every day. Now you've been down to the border, I assume, and you've probably seen not these specific facilities because no one's allowed in, but similar kinds of facilities, and you're familiar with the process. Can you describe for our listeners what happens when an unaccompanied minor crosses the Rio Grande and comes across a Border Patrol agent? What happens to that teenager or that child?
Sure, they're processed in by the Border Patrol agent, which takes time. It takes hours to process in a single person, whether it's a child or an adult. And at that point, they're moved into the holding facilities.
At the border.
At the border. These are generally the same facilities that they hold adults who are seeking to migrate into the U.S. and have been caught or turned themselves in. There's been a rule in place for about 12 years that says that they are only supposed to be held for 72 hours at the most. At this point, the volume of encounters with children is so large that they're having to hold children up to 7 to 10 days at a time before they can find a family in the U.S. that can take them in.
And the facilities themselves, we should be clear, we should distinguish, I guess, between the Customs and Border Protection facilities on the border and the shelters that are run by the Department of Health and Human Services where these minors can be held for longer than 72 hours. The border facilities are just basically, if they're not temporary tent facilities like the ones that were the photos that were released on Monday, they're just like concrete cells or rooms, kind of almost like jails, essentially, right?
Right. They're just holding facilities. At times, they're just large rooms with a lot of cots on the floor. I think that's what's at this point. That's pretty much what we're dealing with. But you're right. The unaccompanied minors are supposed to be placed by Health and Human Services with families in the U.S. who can take them in. But again, it's taking longer than 3 days to get that done.
And I think an important point about the families that is not really making its way into the conversation. Biden himself seems to show no understanding of this at all, based on his comments today in front of the news cameras when he was sort of naming the vice president as his border czar. He talked about how families, in Central America don't sit around saying, "Hey, wouldn't it be great if we, sold all our possessions and like sent our children alone to the U.S.-Mexico border." In fact, the vast majority of the children being apprehended unaccompanied already have a parent in the United States. In other words, they're not sending their children. In many cases, they're sending for their children and paying smugglers, and we'll get into that, to bring their children essentially to them. And one of the things, the messaging that people are picking up or they're selling all their possessions so they can just release their children into the hands of smugglers and they face an unknown future in the United States is not quite accurate, is it? Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, that's exactly what often happens is a migrant adult or a migrant family will make their way into the U.S. and they'll send for the children, unaccompanied minors later. Then unaccompanied minors have an encounter with Border Patrol. Health and Human Services will then reach out to, or the family will reach out to Health and Human Services and say, "Oh, we're the parents," and that seems a natural, easy solution for Health and Human Services. Where under Trump, they were being forced to identify themselves as not having legal status in the U.S., which was creating problems. And Biden has stopped that now. They don't have to kind of self-identify as being illegally in the country when they claim their children.
And the point of doing that is to encourage them to come forward and claim the children, right?
Right. Yeah, it's an easy solution for Health and Human Services if there's a parent already in the country, obviously.
So in a way, the federal agencies, in this case, Customs and Border Protection and Health and Human Services, not to mention, the Border Patrol agents themselves and the local sheriffs, or the National Guard, whomever is assisting Border Patrol sort of on the Rio Grande, are acting as middlemen between the smuggling organization and the families in the U.S. And essentially they're just one more step in the process of ferrying these children from Central America to homes, to their parents' homes in many cases, all across the United States in points from, California to New York to Florida to Illinois to everywhere.
Absolutely, that's effectively is what is happening. That CBP and HSS is sort of a step in the process for getting full families up in the U.S. And in a lot of cases not legally in the U.S.
And is this known? Is this something that the parents are very aware of, and the smuggling networks are very aware of, so that they are able to leverage the policies and the sort of bureaucratic structure of the federal government in this way?
Yeah, the trafficking organizations themselves, when they're down in Central America, will coach the families on how to do this. It's something that's been done for years and years and years.
So the trafficking organizations are savvy to what U.S. policy is. Are they also aware of changes to U.S. policy? Like, how sensitive are they to executive orders or directives to CBP and stuff like that?
Well, the organizations themselves are just making money. They're businesses. So if there's something said by the Biden administration, if there's some message that's being sent by DHS, they'll play that in a way that's gonna try to get where they can sell it to the migrant families in Central America and try to get more of them up. So any kind of messaging that comes out of the Biden administration or DHS that makes it appear as if the borders are open, they're gonna be shouting that down there and telling folks it's time to come up.
Did you see this Reuters report recently that came out just a few days ago, where they found something like a dozen smugglers and interviewed them in Central America and Mexico, and these smugglers essentially said that they were now kind of marketing to potential customers to send children, and they were in some cases taking groups of all children, like all minors, we're ferrying them through Mexico and then across the border because it's easier, because you don't have to evade Border Patrol. You just cross the border and then find a Border Patrol agent and turn yourselves in. And the parents were more likely to pay the money to have their children sent because there was no risk of the children being sent back to Mexico and having to start over. Did you see this? This report? It's a remarkably detailed account of smugglers talking about sort of their industry as you said, as a money-making enterprise.
Right. I'm not sure if I saw that specific report, but you're absolutely right. I mean, it's right now. It's loud and clear that unaccompanied minors are coming into the U.S. and that none of them are being turned away, so that they can guarantee 100% success rate essentially to folks who are wanting to send their children up into the U.S. or who are coming into the U.S. and then sending for their children to come up.
So let's talk a little bit about the report that you wrote, because that bears directly on what we're talking about, on how the criminal network of migrant smuggling and migrant trafficking work in Central America and Mexico. Because one of the things that this Reuters report mentioned was that they are trying, because of the volume of minors and families that are willing to pay, they're trying to speed up the process, and they're now using commercial flights from Central America to cities in Mexico to sort of get them closer to the border faster so that they can keep up with demand and get them up to the US-Mexico border in a more timely fashion, so they can make more money, essentially, because they make money on volume. Sure. How do you described in your paper the difference between migrant smuggling and migrant trafficking, and that sometimes there's an overlap, and sometimes there is a it's kind of a fluid. Those two things are a bit fluid depending on the circumstances. Tell us a little bit about the difference between smuggling and trafficking and how it works with some of these smuggling organizations.
The smuggling organizations are generally very small organizations of maybe 2 or 3 people, up to 5 or 10 possibly, but they have connections stretching from Central America all the way up into the U.S., and they can arrange step by step, point by point for a person that wants to be smuggled into the U.S. At every step, from paying taxes to the cartels that are controlling the territories, all the way up to the getting them across the border. Trafficking organizations tend to do it in a more forceful manner. They'll traffic anything from drugs to people, to weapons, and those folks are again, they're businesses, they're profit maximizers, but there isn't the same level of voluntariness on behalf of the person being trafficked. Those are the ones that exploit folks who are trying to make their way to the United States.
About, so in this case, it would be like sex trafficking or forcing
labor.
migrants to carry drugs across the border as to pay their passage or whatever, right?
Sure, that's another example. Or forced labor. They take a lot of times younger males up to the U.S. and then put them into force them into doing work that is undesirable.
Here in the U.S.
Yes.
So in other words, their involvement with these people doesn't end when they cross the border or evade border patrol or get released from federal custody or whatever. And in some cases, and I want to talk about this too, because even the smuggling organizations in some cases are they're not taking payment up front. The people that they're smuggling are indebted to them, and they continue to extract payments from them after they're in the United States. Correct?
No, that's correct. Absolutely correct. And HSS again kind of plays a role in that, because when we're talking about unaccompanied minors, they'll come up, they'll hold the unaccompanied minor, and then someone will reach out to them and say, "Hey, I know that person. He's my cousin. This is my nephew, my niece." And HSS doesn't have the time to vet everyone that's making those claims, so they send the kid off to whoever that was, and it turns out that's a labor or sex trafficking operation.
And do we have any idea how prevalent that is, how common that is, or what the numbers? Is there any data about what numbers we're dealing with there?
I'm not sure what the numbers are. I'm not sure that that's out there, but it is an anecdotal story that we're hearing over and over again. So it definitely is happening, but the numbers, it'd be impossible to really tell.
So tell me about the role of the cartels in this. In your paper, you talk about a lot of the major drug cartels in Mexico, which by now are well known to a lot of Americans, a lot of people who follow the news, the Sinaloa cartel, the remnants of the Zeta cartel or the Gulf cartel. What role do these very large multinational criminal cartels play in this migrant traffic or this migrant black market?
Sure. Generally, those large transnational criminal organizations don't engage in human trafficking themselves, just because the margins aren't the same as they can't make as much off trafficking a person as they can make off trafficking cocaine coming from South America. So they're not really necessarily in the business, but they do tax anyone trying to move anything through their territories. So they are profiting off the human trafficking problem by taxing the caravans as they come through. There are some exceptions to that along the Texas border, the remnants of the Zetas and the Gulf cartel. At times in the past, I believe they continue to engage in human trafficking. But for the most part, the cartels are only they're profiting off of human trafficking, but they're not actually engaging in human trafficking.
So essentially, the smugglers are in a contractual relationship with the cartels that control territory that the smugglers need to get through and get their customers through. So they just add a fee sort of on top of what they're charging the migrants, and that fee is passed on to the cartels that control the actual crossing at the border, correct?
Right. The smugglers pay the cartels to be allowed to move through the territory that the cartels control. And that's the same if they were smuggling drugs through that territory, they'd have to pay the local cartel to move through it. Or any contraband, it's not just human trafficking.
To what extent is there coordination? Because you mentioned in your paper that sometimes large crossings of migrants will be timed with cartel activities to tie up Border Patrol resources. How common is that?
There are definitely anecdotal examples of that happening in the past, where the cartel controlling a port, a land port, will have a caravan go up in one direction with the intention of moving, a load of cocaine in a completely different direction, knowing that CBP is going to gravitate toward the caravan. Another example of cartels taking advantage of human trafficking caravans would be that sometimes they'll put mochilas, which are Spanish word for backpacks, on these immigrants, and backpacks contain drugs, and they'll tell them, after you cross, go to a certain place at a certain time, drop it off. And
given what you're describing, and given the volume that we're seeing now, we're on record to have probably the largest surge of illegal immigration, maybe not just in 20 years, as Mayorkas said, maybe in 100 years or more, maybe the largest one ever, if we continue along the lines that we're continuing. What can be done from a policy perspective? What should be done from a policy perspective to combat illegal migrant smuggling, migrant trafficking, and the cartels that essentially play the role of a kind of government in northern Mexico, controlling the flow of illegal narcotics and people across the border? What are the solutions here?
I think if we're thinking long term, and if we're talking about Mexico, the big issue there is corruption. The transnational criminal organizations, the cartels, exist and are so powerful in Mexico because of the corrupt Mexican government is protecting them. I think when we talk about long-term solutions to immigration from Central America, I think you have to look at the living conditions in Central America and try to come up with ways to change the game down there, and to provide the security for families that live down there, to provide jobs, resources down there for people to live on, because one of the primary reasons they come up is economic, not just for security reasons. So I think improving the quality of life in Central America is a big key there in terms of long-term policy. Short term, I think it's a messaging game. I think we need to send a clear message that the border is not in fact open, and we need to follow through on that, and not in fact let 85% of migrants coming up to the U.S. into the country as we are right now.
Right, your message has to actually match something in reality. You can't say one thing and then everyone sees the opposite. So the message, falls on deaf ears. Nobody cares what you say. Nobody cares that Biden and Mayorkas say that the border is closed. Everyone knows, the smugglers, the migrants, Americans who watch the news, we all know the border is effectively open, unless you're, a single adult, and then you might get caught and sent back. But if you're part of a family group, or if you're a minor traveling alone, you can get in, and if you can get in, you can probably stay.
Absolutely. That's what they're seeing down there.
So short term, for the messaging to be effective, you're saying there needs to be some sort of deterrent policy that matches the messaging, right?
Exactly. We need to make it clear that and including for unaccompanied minors, we need to make it clear that this isn't 100% success rate situation. There still is asylum law. There still are opportunities for people to claim asylum who can make valid asylum claims. but the borders are not, in fact, open, which was kind of the message that came across through Biden's campaign last year and now through the early days of his administration.
Well, my guest has been Josh Jones. He's a senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation covering immigration and border security. Josh, thanks for being with us on the Federalist Radio Hour talking about this. We'll probably talk to you again because the problem is going to get worse in the coming months, not better.
I think you're absolutely right. We're getting into migrant farmer worker season when we typically do get the spike in numbers coming up from Mexico.
All right, well, we'll stay tuned. And again, this has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm John Davidson. Until next time, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.